Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before he learned who she really was. St. Michael's Hospital in Philadelphia smells like antiseptic and floor wax under harsh fluorescent lights that hum with the constancy of a machine that never sleeps. Hannah Clarke arrives at 6:33 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift begins, the way she always does. She moves through the corridors with economy, no wasted steps, no unnecessary pauses. Her scrubs are navy blue, regulation, unremarkable. Her name badge reads H. Clarke, RN in white block letters. Nothing about her draws attention. She unlocks her locker on the third-floor pediatric neurology unit. The worn combat boots sit in the back corner, half hidden behind her spare shift bag. The leather is creased and salt-stained. The heels are worn smooth from miles of terrain that no civilian sidewalk could measure. She touches the boot once, the way other nurses might touch a photograph or a wedding ring, then closes the locker without a sound. To anyone watching, the gesture meant nothing. To Hannah, it meant everything. The boots were proof. The boots were her real name. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. 18 years in the Navy. 3 deployments to Iraq. 1 to Afghanistan. 34 combat operations. More scars than most people had surgical procedures. And now, for the past 7 months, a floor nurse in pediatric neurology at a hospital in Philadelphia, where no one knew who she was beneath the scrubs. The assignment had come through a secure line at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night. A voice she didn't recognize said 4 words, "Ethan Hayes needs you." She didn't ask questions. Questions were for people with the luxury of time. The next morning she'd submitted applications under her civilian credentials, a nursing degree earned online, a work history fabricated through 3 different staffing agencies, references that checked out if you didn't dig too deep. St. Michael's had hired her within 5 days. No background investigation beyond the standard hospital screening. Just another nurse looking for work. The real reason was sleeping in room for 12. Ethan Hayes. 8 years old. Blind since an IED detonated 200 meters from his father's Humvee in Fallujah 4 months ago. The shrapnel had caught him during a community visit program where Colonel Marcus Hayes had brought his son to meet the soldiers under his command in the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. 1 moment of civilian presence in a combat zone. 1 bomb. 1 explosion that changed everything in the time it took for light to stop traveling through a child's eyes. The boy had been transferred to St. Michael's 6 weeks ago after 12 different doctors across 3 different hospitals had issued the same diagnosis. Optic nerve damage. Irreversible. Permanent. The official prognosis was typed in 12 separate medical records, each one a small, cruel confirmation that the child would never see his father's face again. That he would never read a book, drive a car, recognize the faces of people he loved. That his life, at 8 years old, had already been divided into a before and an after. Hannah knew why she was here. Because somewhere in classified cables between the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, someone had flagged a security concern. Because Colonel Hayes had enemies, men who had learned that hurting a soldier's child was cheaper than targeting the soldier himself. Because one of those enemies had made contact with a contact of a contact, and intelligence suggested the boy was vulnerable. A blind child in a hospital made a soft target. So they sent her. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, who had carried for wounded Delta operators through 2 miles of hostile fire in Fallujah. Who understood security protocols in ways that a standard protection detail could not. Who could move through a hospital the way she moved through every other space, invisible, competent, lethal only if required. She arrives at Ethan's room at 7:13 a.m. The boy is awake, his head turned toward the window even though his eyes see nothing. His face is small, angular, marked by the kind of stillness that comes from learning to navigate a world without vision. There's a bandage on his left temple where the shrapnel had entered. His left eye is scarred shut. His right eye tracks sounds now instead of light. "Good morning, Ethan," Hannah says, her voice soft but steady. She moves to the chair beside his bed and checks his vitals on the monitor. Heart rate 78. Oxygen saturation 99%. Blood pressure normal. Everything is exactly where it should be. Are you the new nurse? The boy asks. His voice is thin, uncertain. I am. My name is Hannah. Did Dad ask you to be nice to me? Hannah pauses. The question is small, but it carries the weight of a child's logic. If people are being kind, it must be because they were instructed to be kind. Love, to him now, must feel like pity. No, Hannah says. Your dad didn't ask. I'm here because your care matters. She doesn't touch his shoulder. She doesn't offer false comfort. She simply states facts the way a person who has survived hard things understands them. The boy nods once, then turns his head back toward the window. Hannah spends the next hour reviewing his chart. It's here that the real work begins. The medical history is a chronicle of unnecessary procedures. A neuroimaging study ordered on November 14, contrast-enhanced MRI with gadolinium injection, a routine scan that cost the insurance company $4,847. 8 days later, a repeat of the same study. Then another. 3 identical scans within 2 weeks. Then a lumbar puncture, tapping spinal fluid to assess inflammation levels. Negative result. Then it was ordered again 3 days later. Identical negative result. Then evoke potential testing. Then additional imaging with diffusion tensor protocols. Each procedure is documented, each one justified by a physician's note, each one generating a bill that climbs higher. Hannah's hands move across the keyboard with the precision of someone writing down coordinates. She creates a separate document, offline, unsaved to the hospital system, hidden in an encrypted file protected by a password that is the name of her first ship spelled backwards and a latitude. She begins charting the billing patterns. The dates. The procedure codes. The insurance companies. The physicians authorizing each test. By 10 a.m., when she's only been in the hospital for 3 hours, the pattern is already clear as a targeting reticle. 18 procedures in 4 months. An average cost of $6,200 per procedure. $111,600 in total billing. Ethan Hayes is being turned into a revenue stream. His blindness is being monetized. And Dr. Whitfield, Chief of Pediatric Neurology, has authorized every single one. Hannah's jaw clenches, just once, a brief tightening of the muscles in her face that disappears almost before it exists. She continues charting. Dr. Whitfield arrives on the unit at 11:32 a.m. He's tall, with the kind of bearing that comes from growing up with money and attending the right schools. His name tag reads Art Whitfield, MD, in gold lettering. His watch is a $12,000 Omega Seamaster. His shoes are Italian leather. He walks the hallway the way a man walks through a room he owns. He stops at Ethan's room and reviews the chart without speaking. His eyes move across the pages, then shift to Hannah, who is updating the 4 fluids on the stand beside the boy's bed. Nurse Clarke, he says. It's not a greeting. Dr. Whitfield. How long have you been here? 3 months and 12 days, sir. He nods slowly. And in that time, have you noticed that the Hayes boy is a particularly complex case? Multiple system involvement. Significant neurological compromise. Requires extensive monitoring. Hannah doesn't flinch. She doesn't blink. She simply adjusts the 4 line with steady hands and continues her work. His presentation is straightforward, she says quietly. Optic nerve damage. The imaging doesn't change treatment options. Whitfield's face doesn't move, but something shifts in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that this nurse has read his chart the way a soldier reads terrain. I'll determine what treatment requires, he says flatly. You'll execute. Nothing more. Then he turns and walks away before she can respond, his footsteps clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a clock counting down. Hannah finishes her charting. Her hands remain perfectly steady. At 12:11 p.m., the hospital cafeteria is crowded with the lunch shift, nurses, orderlies, residents, attending physicians moving through the line with trays of food and conversations that overlap like hospital monitors. Hannah stands near the salad station, her tray containing a sandwich, an apple, a cup of black coffee. She's not particularly hungry. She rarely is. Food is fuel. Nothing more. Dr. Whitfield is 3 tables away, sitting with 3 junior residents, gesturing with his fork as he speaks. His voice carries the kind of confidence that comes from never being contradicted. Hannah doesn't look directly at him, but she can track his movement the way she tracks everything, by sound, by air pressure, by the small disturbances that people make as they move through space. Whitfield stands up suddenly. He walks directly toward Hannah's position. The residents follow, their faces uncertain, their body language deferential. Whitfield has the kind of power that makes younger doctors anxious. "Nurse Clarke," he says loudly enough that the cafeteria begins to quiet. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier." Hannah turns slowly. Her expression is neutral. Her eyes are calm. "So, I made a small wager with these residents," Whitfield continues, gesturing to the 3 doctors behind him. "I told them that you wouldn't last another week here. That the actual demands of this position would exceed your capabilities. That you'd realize you're simply not equipped to handle the complexity of our patient population." He pauses. He waits for a response. Hannah gives him none. Her silence seems to anger him, but he presses forward. "So I think it's only fair," he says, "that you understand exactly what you're dealing with." Then he swings his lunch tray deliberately into the side of hers. Food scatters across the tile floor, sandwich, apple, coffee cup rolling across the white squares like a small, pathetic accident. Whitfield's face is perfectly composed. His eyes watch her, waiting for her to react. One of the residents laughs. Then another. Then all 3 of them are laughing, the sound spreading through the cafeteria like a contagion. "Oh, and you dropped something," Whitfield says. He picks up the patient chart Hannah had been carrying and tosses it onto the floor beside the scattered food. His voice drops into something intimate, something designed specifically for her ears. "Pick that up, sweetheart. And maybe while you're down there, think about whether this job is really worth your time." The room has gone dead silent. Everyone is watching. Everyone is waiting to see what happens next. Hannah's jaw clenches once. The trembling that comes is not fear, it's something else entirely, something older and harder and far more dangerous. It's the trembling of a hand that remembers how to break things. But her eyes remain calm. And when she kneels down to gather the scattered items from the floor, she moves with the same measured grace she always uses. She doesn't speak. She doesn't cry. She doesn't defend herself. She simply retrieves the patient chart, sets it carefully on her tray beside the scattered food, and stands up again. Her face shows nothing. Her breathing remains steady. She turns and walks toward the exit with the same economy of movement she always uses. Behind her, the laughter continues. But that's not where the story ended. Not even close. That evening, at 6:43 p.m., Hannah sits alone in her car in the parking lot of St. Michael's. The lot is nearly empty now, just the night shift beginning to arrive. Rain starts to fall, not heavy, just a steady percussion against the windshield. She grips the steering wheel with both hands, and for exactly 30 seconds, she allows her knuckles to turn white. In those 30 seconds, she doesn't think about her nursing career. She doesn't think about the hospital or Dr. Whitfield or the 3 residents who laughed. She thinks about Ethan Hayes, a boy who will spend the rest of his life unable to see the faces of people who hurt him. She thinks about Colonel Marcus Hayes, a man who trusts her to protect his son in a world where protection is an increasingly difficult promise to keep. She thinks about the truth that no one in this hospital understands, that the person they're humiliating isn't a floor nurse. That the person they're testing isn't someone who breaks easily. That the person they're disrespecting is a Master Chief Petty Officer who has carried wounded soldiers through hostile terrain for 18 years. After 30 seconds, her hands release the wheel. The whiteness drains from her knuckles. She takes a breath that is steady and controlled and speaks to a discipline that has been forged in places that civilian hospitals will never understand. She starts the car. She drives home. And she makes a decision that will eventually bring everyone at St. Michael's Hospital to understand exactly what they have underestimated. The nurses' station at St. Michael's smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. Hannah Clarke stood at the main terminal, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency when she heard Dr. Whitfield's voice cut through the afternoon corridor noise. He wasn't alone. 3 residents trailed behind him like satellites orbiting a dying star. "Nurse Clarke," Whitfield said, his tone carrying that particular edge reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. "A word." Hannah's jaw tightened once. She saved the chart entry and turned to face him, her expression neutral as a calm pond. Whitfield leaned against the counter with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no by an institution. His tailored coat probably cost more than Hannah's monthly rent. "I've noticed you've been quite thorough with your charting. Thorough for someone with your limited credentials, anyway." He glanced at his residents. One of them smirked. "Community college, wasn't it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Hannah's hands remained perfectly steady as she continued entering data into the computer. "I completed my nursing prerequisites through an accelerated program, Doctor. My clinical training was at Bethesda Naval Medical Center." It was true enough. What she didn't mention was that Bethesda was where trauma surgeons trained officers for field medicine under fire. Where she'd learned to stabilize hemorrhagic shock with her hands in the sand. Where limited credentials meant surviving things that killed people with doctorates. Whitfield's smile thinned. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. That's the hierarchy of a hospital. Surely you understand hierarchy." "Yes, sir," Hannah said. Her voice was quiet, so quiet that one of the residents had to lean in to hear. But there was something underneath it. Something like the sound a submarine makes when it surfaces. 2 days later, the cafeteria at St. Michael's was half full with the lunch crowd. Hannah stood in line with her tray, keeping to the rhythm of people who didn't want to be noticed. Whitfield sat at a corner table with 4 attending physicians, the kind of men who wrote policies, who controlled medical boards, who could end careers with a single phone call to the right person. His voice carried across the cafeteria with the confidence of someone who knew he wouldn't be challenged. "Gentlemen, I'm making a prediction." Whitfield gestured toward Hannah with his water glass. "Our overachieving Nurse Clarke here won't last a week in pediatric care. She's in over her head, and she knows it. Anyone want to bet against me? $20 says she submits her resignation within 7 days." 2 of the doctors laughed. 1 shook his head. The 4th, a woman with grey streaking her temples, said nothing. She just watched. Hannah picked up her tray. Tomato soup, a sandwich, an apple. Simple things. Neutral things. She was halfway to an empty table when she heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back. Whitfield stood abruptly. His elbow caught the edge of her tray with surgical precision, not clumsy enough to seem accidental, not violent enough to be obvious. The tray tipped. Soup cascaded across her white scrubs in a spreading stain. The plastic cup clattered against the tile floor. The cafeteria went very, very quiet. "How clumsy," Whitfield said. His voice was honey smooth. He pulled Ethan Hayes' chart from under his arm, the boy's medical file, confidential and marked, sitting there like a weapon. He tossed it at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart. And maybe review it so you understand why I ordered those tests instead of questioning my medical judgment." Hannah stood absolutely still. She didn't flinch. She didn't flush red. She didn't retreat. Her face showed nothing at all, the kind of nothing that comes from having learned, long ago, that showing emotion to an enemy was a form of surrender. The 3 residents at Whitfield's table started laughing. It was the laughter of people who'd never faced consequences, who'd never learned what it cost to maintain composure in front of someone who wanted to break you. Hannah bent smoothly. She picked up the chart. She picked up the tray. She walked to the kitchen area and returned with a mop and bucket, the wheels squeaking softly against the tile. She cleaned the soup from the cafeteria floor while Whitfield watched, while the residents watched, while the grey-haired woman kept her eyes on Hannah with an expression that might have been calculation or might have been recognition. When the floor was clean, Hannah dumped the bucket, rinsed the mop, returned the supplies to the utility closet, and clocked out for her break. That night, alone in her car in the parking garage at 11:11 p.m., Hannah gripped the steering wheel. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. The trembling was restraint. 30 seconds. That's how long she allowed herself. 30 seconds of her knuckles turning white against the leather, of her breathing becoming controlled and mechanical, of every trained instinct in her body screaming to do things that would end everything. At 31 seconds, she released her hands. She started the engine. She drove home through the rain. The next morning, Hannah pulled Ethan Hayes' complete medical file and spread it across her kitchen table before work. She had access, she was his assigned pediatric nurse. She had clearance from Colonel Hayes himself, though he'd never know to what extent she'd use it. Her eyes moved across the documentation with the same precision she'd used to read tactical maps in forward operating bases. The pattern was there. She'd seen it in fragments before, but laid out chronologically, it became impossible to deny. For scans in 6 weeks. An MRI, a CT with contrast, another MRI, and now, dated for tomorrow morning, another contrast-enhanced study ordered by Dr. Whitfield despite the boy's stable neurological condition. Hannah pulled his initial intake summary. A note, buried 3 layers deep in the digital files, from Fallujah General where Ethan had been first treated, possible sensitivity to iodinated contrast agents. Recommend allergy testing before any future imaging. Differential diagnosis pending. That was 18 months ago. The allergy testing had never been completed. She documented her findings in the nursing notes, objective, factual, 3 sentences, and submitted a formal request to delay the scheduled MRI pending an iodine sensitivity workup. She used the proper channels. She was careful. She was professional. The request came back within an hour, marked in red digital ink, denied. Dr. Whitfield. The MRI was scheduled for 8:33 a.m. Hannah arrived at the hospital at 6:19 a.m. and checked Ethan's chart one final time. His grandmother had signed the informed consent. Colonel Marcus Hayes was deployed to Bagram with the 75th Ranger Regiment, 6,000 miles away, unreachable. There was no one to push back. There was no one but her. She found Ethan in his room, already in hospital scrubs, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. His eyes, those eyes that would never see again, tracked the sound of her footsteps with practiced precision. "Good morning, buddy," Hannah said. Her voice was soft but steady. "Big day. We're going to do one more picture of your brain. Make sure everything is healing up nice." Ethan nodded. He trusted her. Children did. They could sense the difference between someone managing them and someone actually present. "Will it hurt?" "No pain," Hannah said. "Just some loud noises and bright lights. You'll be okay." She prepped him. Checked his vitals at 7:15 a.m. Heart rate 88. O2 sat 97%. Blood pressure 102/68. All normal. All stable. She documented everything. At 8:34 a.m., she wheeled Ethan toward radiology on the gurney, her hand steady on the metal rail. One corridor, then another. The smell of the hospital pressing down, antiseptic and something underneath it, something like fear. Ethan reached for her hand. "Miss Hannah," he said, his voice small and young and asking for something she couldn't quite give him. "My chest feels funny." Hannah stopped the gurney immediately. "Funny how, sweetheart? Tell me exactly." "Like it's too tight. Like I can't take a deep breath." She checked his pulse. Already climbing. 94, 98. Her eyes moved to the pulse oximeter clipped to his small finger. 94% oxygen saturation. That was a 5-point drop in 90 seconds. She was watching his oxygen start to fall in real time. This was the moment. She could feel it like pressure before a storm. This was the moment that separated people who followed orders from people who trusted their own training. Hannah pulled her radio from her pocket and called for Dr. Whitfield. Code calm. Nothing alarming. Just a nurse flagging a clinical concern. He arrived in radiology 3 minutes later, his expression already irritated. He was moving with purpose, the way men move when they've already decided what reality should be and don't intend to let facts get in the way. Doctor, the patient is showing early signs of a contrast sensitivity reaction, Hannah said. Her voice was professional, measured. Chest tightness, O2 sat dropping from 97 to 94 in the last 90 seconds. His allergy profile shows a possible iodine sensitivity from his initial treatment in theater. I'm recommending we delay this procedure and run a full allergy panel before proceeding. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He looked at her the way a man looks at an insect that somehow developed the ability to speak. Let me be very clear about something, Nurse Clarke. You are a nurse. I am a physician. The scan happens in 10 minutes, or you need to understand what the consequences of insubordination look like in a hospital setting. Hannah felt the weight of those words settle around her shoulders. She knew exactly what the consequences looked like. She'd seen them in the cafeteria 2 days ago. She'd watched a man use his position like a weapon and seen no one push back. Doctor, she said quietly, the patient is showing measurable signs of. The scan happens. Now, Whitfield said. He personally took the gurney from her hands. His fingers closed around the metal rail where Hannah's had been. Step aside. Hannah stepped aside. She watched Whitfield wheel Ethan into the radiology suite. She heard Ethan's small voice asking questions. She heard the technician's voice, reassuring. She stood in the hallway and pulled her phone from her pocket and began recording the timestamp, the vital signs, the exact sequence of events, building a documentation trail that would either protect her child or end her career. She was still recording when the first alarm sounded from inside the scanning room. The alarm on Ethan's monitor sounded at 7:43 a.m. Hannah saw it first, the heart rate climbing where it shouldn't, the oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. She was standing at the radiology tech's shoulder when the contrast dye began flowing into the boy's fur line through the MRI machine's bore, and something in her chest seized. She'd read his chart 3 times the night before. Ethan's allergy panel, buried under 6 pages of Whitfield's own documentation, clearly flagged a reaction to gadolinium contrast agents. A note in faded pen from Ethan's first hospital stay read, maternal history of anaphylaxis to iodine-based compounds. The risk was there. Documented. Ignored. His spiking a reaction, the tech said, not quite understanding what she was seeing. The numbers don't lie. Oxygen saturation 98, normal. Then 94. Then 89. The boy's breathing had changed, shallow, rapid, the sound of a small animal trapped in a cage. Hannah could hear the shift in his lung sounds through the monitor speaker, hear the wheeze beginning deep in his chest. Hannah had already moved before the monitor alarmed. She was at the MRI machine, pulling Ethan out of the bore with one hand steady as a surgical laser while the other hit the emergency code button mounted on the wall. The boy's lips were starting to turn blue. Not the deep cyanotic blue of a child drowning slowly, but the pale powder blue of a body shutting down. His eyes were closed. His small body was rigid with the spasm of anaphylaxis. Ethan, she said, voice level, I'm here. Stay with me. The radiology tech stood frozen, which meant Hannah was alone with a child in catastrophic shock. She carried him to the code bay adjacent to the scanning suite and laid him on the trauma stretcher, her hands already working. Gloves snapped like gunshots against her palms. She grabbed the crash cart, muscle memory taking over, the kind of memory that doesn't require thinking, just doing. The kind of memory forged in the dust outside Fallujah when the IED went off and the screaming started. The code team arrived in pieces. The resident came first, then 2 nurses, then a respiratory tech dragging the intubation equipment. They were good. They moved with purpose. But they were moving at hospital speed, which in anaphylaxis is the speed of a funeral march. Ethan's oxygen saturation was 71. His lips were no longer blue, they were nearly grey, the color of a child's body sacrificing blood from his extremities to keep his brain alive. For how much longer, Hannah didn't know. Epinephrine, IM, the resident ordered, and one nurse was already drawing it from the crash cart. But Ethan's heart rhythm was erratic on the monitor, that rapid fluttering that meant his heart was no longer pumping blood, it was just quivering. Ventricular fibrillation. The rhythm of a drowning heart. Paddles, someone said. They shocked him at 200 joules. His small body arched off the stretcher. The monitor showed the same rhythm. They shocked again at 300. Still the same. That's when Dr. Whitfield arrived in the doorway, having somehow been called despite no one alerting him. He took in the scene with the calculation of a man used to controlling rooms. 12 doctors, Hannah counted without turning her head. 12 of them standing in the doorway now, watching a child die, and none of them were moving past the threshold. They were afraid of the infection risk, or afraid of contaminating the crash cart, or afraid of stepping into the space where mistakes happen and lawsuits are born. Fear dressed up as protocol. Pericardiocentesis, Whitfield ordered. Get the ultrasound probe. We'll aspirate the fluid around the heart. Cardiac tamponade. That's what Hannah saw on the monitor, not just ventricular fibrillation, but the pattern of a heart being crushed by its own fluid. The pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, had filled with fluid from the anaphylactic reaction. The pressure was strangling his cardiac function. A pericardiocentesis would work, theoretically. They'd puncture the pericardium with a needle, draw out the fluid, by the heart room to beat again. Theoretically. While they were setting up the ultrasound probe and searching for the right needle in a crash cart that suddenly felt very large and very disorganized, Ethan's oxygen saturation dropped to 42. His core temperature was beginning to plummet. His brain was dying. Every second that passed without blood reaching his neurons, something permanent was happening. Irreversible. Hannah saw it in the monitor's rhythm. She saw it in the grey color of his lips. She saw it in the way his small body had gone utterly still, not even the micro-movements of struggling anymore, that meant shutdown, that meant the end coming fast. She made a decision that would either save his life or ensure she never worked in medicine again. The scalpel was in her hand before she consciously reached for it. It was from the crash cart, the sterile pack opened by someone else's hands, and she didn't hesitate. The blade caught the fluorescent light as she moved it to the space below Ethan's sternum. One vertical incision, clean, the kind of cut that becomes a scar a child grows up to either forget or explain to future lovers. Below his sternum. 2 inches. The angle slightly to the left to miss the liver. Blood welled up immediately, the color of a child's blood, brighter somehow than adult blood, or maybe that was just the shock of seeing it. The scalpel went back into the cart and Hannah's hands went into the wound. The ribs were small, delicate as a bird's cage. She spread them apart with her bare fingers, not rough but with absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from having done this before when the alternative was watching someone die. "What are you doing?" Whitfield's voice cracked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Hannah didn't answer. There was no time for answers. Her right hand was inside Ethan's chest cavity, her fingers finding his heart in the darkness, warm, slippery, no larger than her own closed fist. She began direct cardiac massage, compressing his heart in the rhythm she'd learned from a Delta Force combat medic named Chief Graves who'd been teaching her to save lives in the seconds before helicopter evacuation could arrive. Firm pressure. 1, 2, 3. Her finger against his left ventricle, pushing blood toward his brain. 1, 2, 3. The room was silent except for the monitors and the sound of her compressions, the soft wet sound of a child's heart being squeezed back to life by hands that had been trained for this in desert compounds and forward operating bases. 53 seconds. That's how long she compressed his heart while the 12 doctors in the doorway finally broke their paralysis and moved into the room, though they didn't touch him, didn't interfere, just watched as though bearing witness to something outside the bounds of hospital protocol. 53 seconds and Ethan's heart spasmed under her fingertips. It was a sensation like nothing else, the sudden return of purpose, of rhythm. A muscle remembering how to work. The monitor showed it before Hannah felt it, a beat. Then another. Then a pattern, erratic but present, the electrical activity of a heart trying to live. Sinus rhythm. Not perfect, but possible. Ethan's eyes fluttered. His small body gasped, his lungs pulling air on their own, his brain suddenly receiving blood again after 90 seconds of starvation. His lips began to pink. Hannah withdrew her hands and stepped back, blood dripping from her fingers onto the tile floor. Someone should have cheered. Someone should have said something. Instead, the room held its breath in the way rooms do after witnessing something that breaks all the rules and works anyway. Then Whitfield's voice, cold and sharp and carrying the weight of a man suddenly understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered, everyone out. Now. The surgeons arrived in under 4 minutes. 2 of them, Dr. Patterson from cardiothoracic and Dr. Reeves from pediatric anesthesia, moved with the controlled urgency of people who'd seen this before. They didn't say anything about the blood. They didn't say anything about Hannah's hands. They simply took the position she'd held and began the work of closing what she'd opened, their movements precise and practiced, the kind of precision that only came from 10,000 hours in a trauma bay. The monitors showed what mattered. Ethan's heart was beating. The O2 sat climbed back to 94. Sinus rhythm returned. The machines confirmed what her hands already knew. Patterson glanced at her once. Just once. His eyes carried a question he wasn't permitted to ask, not with 12 other doctors still standing in the doorway, not with the entire code team witnessing what had happened in this room. Hannah's scrubs were soaked with a child's blood. Her hands were steady as she stepped back from the table, but every attending physician in that room had watched her crack open a pediatric chest with nothing but a crash cart scalpel and muscle memory that belonged in a combat hospital, not St. Michael's in Philadelphia. She walked to the sink. The water ran red down the drain like rust bleeding from old metal. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She simply scrubbed, methodical and controlled, while behind her the surgeons finished their work and Ethan Hayes, 8 years old, blind, and still alive, moved toward recovery. Dr. Whitfield didn't appear until the boy was stable enough for transport to the pediatric ICU. He stood in the doorway of the procedure room with his arms folded, his face a mask of administrative fury. Then he turned and walked directly to his office. Hannah knew what was about to happen. She'd seen it before in a different uniform, different country, the moment when a man realizes his position is threatened, when the calculations shift from gradual to desperate, when he stops playing politics and starts playing for survival. The first phone call was to hospital administration. Hannah knew this because she heard him through the partially closed office door, his voice carrying the kind of controlled rage that only came when someone was trying very hard not to shout. An unauthorized surgical procedure. On a pediatric patient. Without supervision or consent. She heard him pause, heard the administrator's response in the muffled distance. No, I'm not exaggerating. She performed open-chest cardiac massage with a scalpel from a crash cart. She's a floor nurse, not a surgeon. This is criminal negligence. This is her license. Another pause. I want her terminated today. Before she kills someone else. The second call came 15 minutes later. Whitfield had dialed the state nursing board directly, his voice smoother now, almost concerned. I'm calling with a professional concern about one of our staff members. Nurse Hannah Clarke. Yes, I'll spell that. His tone shifted into something that sounded almost regretful. Her judgment has been increasingly unstable. Today she acted without authorization, performed an invasive procedure on a child, and when I attempted to intervene, she became confrontational. He let the word hang. Confrontational. It was the kind of word that made administrators nervous. I'm concerned for patient safety. I'm also concerned for her own mental fitness. Hannah was changing out of her bloody scrubs when he made the third call. This one was to her nursing school at the University of Pennsylvania, a 23-year-old degree, the kind of credentials that looked pristine until someone started asking questions. I need copies of her disciplinary history, Whitfield said, his voice now a model of professional courtesy. We've had an incident here, and I'm trying to understand her background. Any prior concerns about her judgment or emotional stability? Any incidents during her clinical rotations? She heard the pause that meant the registrar was telling him there was nothing, no flags, no incidents, a perfect record. But the damage was already done. The question had been asked. The seed had been planted. The fourth call was to someone named Mercer, a private investigator Whitfield apparently kept on retainer. I need a records audit, Whitfield said. Start with the last 6 months. Pull every chart she's touched, every notation she made, every patient interaction. Look for discrepancies, medication errors, documentation gaps. Anything that suggests professional negligence. I need it in 72 hours. He hung up without waiting for confirmation. He didn't need to. Men like Whitfield always had someone ready to do the work. By that evening, Hannah had received a formal termination notice hand-delivered by hospital security. The letter cited gross misconduct, practicing medicine without a license, and violation of the hospital's chain of command protocols. It was precise and legal and absolutely airtight. She sat in a small conference room with the hospital administrator, Dr. Kenneth Morris, and the HR director, a woman named Patricia Saunders who avoided eye contact the entire time. You saved that boy's life, Morris said. His hands were folded on the desk. He was a good man, Harvard med, 20 years of experience, the kind of administrator who believed in his institution. The surgical team is clear on that. Patterson told me directly she was the only reason that child didn't code on the table. It doesn't matter, Saunders said quietly. Protocol requires physician authorization for any invasive procedure. She's a floor nurse. She's not credentialed for surgery. If Dr. Whitfield chooses to pursue charges, the hospital's liability. I'm not pursuing charges, Morris interrupted. But we can't protect her if Whitfield does. And frankly, her actions today, however effective, constitute practicing medicine without a license. That's beyond my jurisdiction. That's the state board's decision. Hannah hadn't spoken since she'd walked into the room. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was wearing her civilian clothes, dark jeans, a grey sweater, the kind of outfit that made her invisible in a crowd. She looked like what everyone believed her to be, a nurse who'd made a terrible professional decision. If you sign here, Saunders continued, sliding a document across the desk, you accept the termination without contesting it. You resign in good standing. Whitfield agrees not to press charges. You walk away. And if I don't sign? Hannah's voice was quiet. It was the voice she used with Ethan when he was frightened, steady, calm, the kind of voice that made you believe everything would be okay even when it wouldn't. Then we terminate you for cause. The state board gets involved automatically. Charges are likely. Legal proceedings could take years. Saunders met her eyes for just a moment. You have 2 options. Both end with you leaving this hospital. One is cleaner than the other. Hannah picked up the pen. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook. But as she signed her name on the termination document, a signature that erased 6 months of embedded work, 6 months of monitoring a patient she wasn't permitted to protect, 6 months of building a case against a man she wasn't permitted to accuse, she felt something very close to what civilians called surrender. Muscle memory from 20 years of following protocol, even when protocol was wrong. Even when protocol meant leaving a blind 8-year-old boy vulnerable to a predator in a doctor's coat. The paper was done at 4:17 p.m. Security walked her to her locker. She collected the few personal items she kept there, a spare scrub cap, a photograph of Marcus Jr. from 3 years ago when he was smaller, still young enough to believe his mother was just a nurse, and left through the same emergency entrance she'd arrived at every morning for the past 6 months. The Philadelphia autumn was turning gray, the sky the color of old concrete, the air carrying that particular dampness that came off the Schuylkill River. She drove home in silence. The radio stayed off. Her phone stayed dark. She took the highway instead of the back roads, driving at exactly the speed limit, following every traffic law, moving through the city like a ghost inside a compliance program. The house on Azalea Street was quiet when she pulled into the driveway at 2:33 p.m. Marcus Jr. should have been in school for another 3 hours. There should have been no one home. But the kitchen lights were on. He was 14 now, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the kitchen door frame, her son, the one person in this city who knew nothing about who she really was. He was making a sandwich when she walked in, PB&J on wheat bread, his favorite since he was 7. He froze when he heard the garage door close. Turned. Saw her standing there in her civilian clothes on a Tuesday afternoon. Mom. His voice changed in that moment, the careful teenage distance giving way to genuine concern. Why are you home? Are you sick? Hannah didn't answer. She moved to the kitchen table instead, pulled out one of the chairs with its padding worn thin from 18 years of family dinners, and sat down. The light from the window caught her face at an angle that made her look older, or maybe she was older now, maybe the last 6 hours had added years. Her hands felt foreign on the table surface, the way they always did when she wasn't working, when her body had nowhere to direct the weight of her training. Mom. Marcus Jr. set his sandwich down carefully. He had her eyes, the same grey-blue that looked unforgiving in certain light. Mom, talk to me. What happened? Hannah opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. For the first time in his life, in 14 years of single parenthood, of locked doors and classified assignments, of deploying overseas while her son stayed with her sister, of keeping the biggest part of herself sealed away like a bomb threat, Hannah began to cry. Not silently. Not with the controlled breathing of someone managing emotion. Real tears, the kind that said something fundamental had broken. She didn't know how to explain that she'd been fired for saving a child. She didn't know how to tell him that her entire employment at St. Michael's had been a classified operation, that she'd been placed inside a pediatric ward wearing scrubs and a forged nursing credential to monitor the son of her commanding officer, that the case she'd been building against Dr. Whitfield couldn't be defended without exposing a mission that was still ongoing. She didn't know how to say that by saving Ethan Hayes' life, she'd guaranteed her own professional destruction and the end of the operation that was supposed to protect him. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain. She couldn't do anything except sit at the kitchen table at 2:24 p.m. on a Tuesday and cry while her son stood frozen in the doorway, sandwich forgotten, his mother's face revealing more of her than he'd ever been permitted to see. What's wrong? His voice was small now, frightened in the way a child's voice becomes when the adult they've always trusted suddenly falls apart. Mom, what's wrong? She couldn't answer him. That was the cruelest part. Not the termination. Not losing her position. Not the sacrifice of the last 6 months of work. But sitting at this table, in this kitchen, looking at her 14-year-old son, the one person she'd given everything to protect, and being unable to tell him why she was broken. Being unable to explain that sometimes being a hero meant destroying yourself in the dark, where no one would ever see it. That the people you saved would never know. That your own son would never know. That the cost of protecting others was always measured in silence. What happened next didn't just change everything. It changed her forever. Security escorts Hannah through the lobby of St. Michael's Hospital with a cardboard box balanced against her chest. Her personal effects rattle inside, stethoscope, badge, the framed photo she kept tucked in her locker. Staff members watch from corridor entrances, nurses stopping mid-conversation as she passes. Nobody speaks. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical anthem overhead. She doesn't look at them. Her jaw is set the way it was in that car 3 nights ago, but there's something different now, not restraint. Resignation. The kind of calm that comes only after you've already lost everything that mattered. The escort, a young security officer barely 23, holds the glass door open. Outside, Philadelphia rain hammers the pavement like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. But that wasn't the worst part. A trauma unit screams into the ambulance bay behind her. Red lights strobe across wet asphalt. Hannah hears the radio crackle, 38-year-old male, gunshot wound to the abdomen, ETA 2 minutes, patient is in ICE custody, federal extradition hold. She stops walking. The security guard doesn't notice, he's already back inside, moving toward the warmth. Hannah turns. Through the rain, she watches them wheel the gurney. One of the paramedics is running alongside, bagging oxygen in steady rhythm. The patient's head lolls sideways. Dark eyes open. Eyes that have seen Fallujah the way Hannah has seen it, from the streets where the call to prayer echoes off ruined buildings and the smell of diesel exhaust mixes with something else, something burned and wrong. The insurgent's entire body goes rigid on the stretcher. His head snaps toward Hannah. Recognition floods his face like a switch flipped. His voice comes out thin, fractured, a whisper that somehow carries across 20 feet of rain and concrete, Al-Saida Al-Mort. The Lady of Death. The voice is asking a question and answering one simultaneously. The paramedics don't understand. They move him toward the trauma bay, but his eyes stay locked on her. Al-Saida Al-Mort, he says again, louder, as if saying it twice makes it less real. The veteran security guard, Marcus, his name tag reads, and there's a Navy SEAL pin on his belt, freezes. The blood drains from his face. He's heard that call sign before. Everyone who served in Fallujah between 2004 and 2006 has heard it. Marcus turns back toward Hannah, still standing in the rain with a cardboard box of her life, and his voice carries through the emergency bay doors, loud enough that 3 nurses and an attending stop moving. That's what they called the Master Chief Petty Officer from the Fallujah siege. He stops. He's looking at her hands. Scarred hands. Old scars, pale against brown skin, the kind of scarring that doesn't come from needlestick injuries or accidental contact with hot instruments. The kind that comes from shrapnel and shattered glass and crawling through rubble. The hospital administrator arrives 17 minutes later. He's followed by a Marine general in dress blues, Veterans Affairs liaison, his name tape reads Graves, and 2 individuals in dark suits who don't announce themselves but don't need to. FBI. The administrator looks confused. Graves looks like he's been waiting 17 years for this moment. The general steps forward into the lobby where staff are still staring, and his voice, clipped, precise, the kind of voice that's given orders in sandstorms, reads aloud from a classified file he shouldn't have in public but clearly has, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. 3 bronze stars. He pauses. The hallway is so quiet the rain sounds like gunfire outside. 2 purple hearts. Another pause. Longer this time. A nurse drops a clipboard. The sound echoes. And a Navy cross. General Graves looks up from the file. For carrying for wounded Delta Force operators, including then-Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, through 2 miles of hostile fire in the Jolon district while under sustained enemy contact, March 16, 2005. He closes the folder. You were undercover at this hospital. It's not a question. Before Hannah can answer, and she won't, because some things are classified until the general himself tells you they're not, the elevator doors open. Colonel Marcus Hayes walks out. He's wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater, but he moves like Fallujah is still moving inside him, like every gesture is a controlled detonation of something larger. Behind him is Ethan, his 8-year-old son, holding his father's hand. The boy's eyes are patched on one side, his vision partially restored by a procedure that 12 doctors said was medically impossible. 12 different doctors, and every single one was wrong. The colonel sees Hannah. Recognition floods his face too, but it's different, not fear like the insurgent, not shock like Marcus. It's something that looks like coming home. He places his hand on Ethan's shoulder and steps forward until he's standing inches from a woman they all believed was just a nurse. When he speaks, his voice is quiet enough that only Hannah can hear it clearly, though the hallway has fallen silent enough that everyone listens anyway. She's the reason I'm alive to be your father. The 10 seconds that follow feel like 10 years compressed into the space between heartbeats. Ethan looks up at his father, then at Hannah, then back at his father. The boy's mouth opens like he wants to ask a question but doesn't have the words. That afternoon, the FBI arrests Dr. Marcus Whitfield in his office. They have evidence of healthcare fraud spanning 18 months, unnecessary procedures on 42 patients, insurance billing inflation totaling $847,000, and something worse, falsified personnel documents. Whitfield had forged Hannah's signature on performance reviews that never existed, backdated incident reports describing psychiatric instability that never happened, fabricated transcripts showing disciplinary problems from a nursing school that didn't have her real records. He was building a case to justify terminating her without triggering questions. But he made one critical error. He'd forged her nursing credentials documents, not knowing that her entire file was created by naval intelligence, and any tampering would trigger federal alerts. The moment he modified one page, 3 government agencies received notification simultaneously. The FBI had been investigating St. Michael's billing patterns for 4 months. Hannah's meticulous charting had given them the evidence they needed. 2 agents walk into the ICU at 2:14 p.m. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and falsifying federal documents. The handcuffs click shut. His residents watch from the nursing station. The agents read him his rights while he's standing in front of the same pediatric unit he'd been poisoning with unnecessary procedures. Then comes the walk. Whitfield, in handcuffs, through corridors he'd walked as a man with power. Past the nurses' station where he'd made his betting statement about Hannah quitting within a week. Through the main corridor where staff members stopped moving to watch him pass. And then through the cafeteria. The exact cafeteria where he'd knocked her tray to the floor. Where he'd thrown patient charts at her feet. Where he'd said, "Pick that up, sweetheart," to a woman whose hands had held Delta Force operators together while IED blast shrapnel filled the air. Staff members line the corridor. They watch in silence as his perp walk to the parking garage. His attorney makes a statement outside the hospital: medical disagreement, overzealous prosecution, exoneration expected. Nobody listens. 18 months later, a former resident visiting her mother in Norristown notices something outside a strip mall on Route 611. A folding table. A banner reading supplemental insurance, low rates. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, in khakis and a polo shirt, selling policies to people passing by. The resident keeps walking. She doesn't say hello. St. Michael's Hospital creates a new position in the wake of the scandal. Director of Patient Advocacy, reporting directly to the board. Hannah Clarke accepts. Her office is on the pediatric floor. The worn combat boots, the one she kept hidden in her locker for 3 years, now sit openly on her desk beside a framed Navy Cross citation and a photograph of Colonel Hayes's Delta Force unit. The boots are scarred and cracked from desert sand and blood and things that don't have names. In the photograph, Hannah stands in the middle of 14 operators, her arm around a younger Hayes's shoulders, both of them wearing desert camo. Both of them alive. Ethan Hayes returns for follow-up appointments every month. The procedure Hannah insisted on, the one 12 different doctors said was impossible, has restored partial vision in his left eye. Not full vision. Enough to see shapes. Enough to see faces. Enough to see his father's face clearly, which is what mattered. On a Tuesday morning, Hannah arrives at her office to find a crayon drawing on her chair. It shows an angel with dark hair wearing scrubs. A small boy holding the angel's hand. The angel has wings sketched in yellow crayon. At the bottom, in careful child handwriting, "Thank you for saving me. Love, Ethan." Hannah pins it to her bulletin board next to the duty rosters and policy updates. That afternoon, she teaches a mandatory training session for all attending physicians, recognizing signs of insurance fraud, proper documentation standards, the importance of questioning orders that don't serve the patient. Whitfield's former residents sit in the front row, taking careful notes. When the session ends, Hannah walks through the pediatric ward, checking charts and talking quietly with nurses. To anyone watching, she looks like exactly what she is, a nurse doing her job, invisible and essential. The kind of person the world overlooks until the moment you realize she's been holding everything together all along. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Colonel Hayes watches from the visitor's lounge as she works, Ethan beside him practicing his vision exercises. Neither speaks. They don't need to. They both know what silence sounds like when it's filled with gratitude. Subscribe now for more stories of the people you've underestimated. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room might be the one saving everyone else. And comment, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were?